Welcome, everybody. We'll just wait another minute or two before getting started. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and start tonight's webinar. Thank you for joining us. The title of the presentation tonight is Our Mind Matters on Teen Substance Use, the latest research, some personal stories, and tips for parents and caregivers. I'm Dr. Joanna Quigley. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and pediatrics and the associate medical director of child and adolescent outpatient psychiatry, as well as our addiction treatment services for adolescents at the University of Michigan at UMass. UMass is located at the Rachel Upjohn Building off of Plymouth Road in Ann Arbor and is part of the Addiction Center. A core part of our mission at UMass is to deliver care that is directly informed by research. And with this speaker series, we are hoping to share the latest research on addiction and how it helps to explain how problems related to substance use, what makes them continue, and helpful hints to break out of the cycle of problematic use. Joining us tonight is Dr. Megan Martz. Dr. Martz is Research Assistant Professor at the University of Michigan Addiction Center within the Department of Psychiatry. Her research focuses on psychosocial and neural factors associated with substance use risk and resilience among adolescents and young adults. Dr. Martz received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan, and prior to completing her PhD, she completed a Master's of Social Work from the University of Chicago. In her free time, Megan likes to spend time with her family and play with her Newfoundland puppy. Also joining us is Elliot. Elliot is a young person who has been in recovery since June of 2023. He lives and works in the Ann Arbor area and is involved in the recovery community. In his free time, he pursues filmmaking and screenwriting. Dr. Martz and Elliot, thank you for joining us. And before we begin, I want to mention that questions can be submitted by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and there is an option to submit questions anonymously. After both of the presentations, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, and a recording will be made available and emailed to everyone as soon as it's available. With that, I'd like to begin and turn it over to Dr. Martz.
Thank you, Dr. Quigley, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you all about teen substance use. I'll be covering more of the research side of things and also provide some research-backed tips for parents, caregivers, and also teens themselves. So just to frame today's talk, first, I'll be going over trends in adolescent substance use, just to give an idea of what are the most commonly used substances and what is the extent of use in teens. And then risk factors for adolescent substance use and resources as well. So first, starting out with trends in use. So here you can see past year alcohol use by 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. So by 12th grade, a little over half of youth have reported alcohol use in the past year. One type of drinking that we're particularly concerned about is binge drinking. And so this is a type of drinking that brings your BAC to about 0.08 or greater, which typically coincides with about 4 drinks or more for women and 5 drinks or more for men on a single occasion. And what constitutes a drink is something that a lot of people are really unsure of. And so in this figure down here on the bottom left, I have what is a standard drink across different drink types. And so here you can see trends in binge drinking across 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. So the good news is that binge drinking is decreasing in recent years. But we see that these decreases are less pronounced for young adults, and rates of alcohol use are increasing in women. And so the people's relationship with alcohol in adolescence does have implications for later use rates. Here you can see past your nicotine vaping. We don't really talk about cigarette use that much anymore because rates have really plummeted. But in place of that, the e-cigarette and vaping has become a lot more prevalent. So by about 12th grade, a little over a quarter of youth report past year use of this substance. And for e-cigarette and vaping, it's most commonly used in adolescents in terms of the flavored products. So there's been in the news a little bit about how laws are changing on reducing the availability of flavored use because it does seem to be catering more to teens. And now you can see here for cannabis use. So I'll use cannabis and marijuana interchangeably. And so rates of cannabis use are actually higher now than vaping and e-cigarette use. So about 30% of youth by age 12th grade have reported past year cannabis use. And so these trends are definitely increasing. So perception of harm is going down and increasing use is happening, especially in relation to increased legalization. But this is concerning because the type of marijuana people are using today is a lot different than the type of marijuana that used to exist a few decades ago. And this is because the THC in cannabis products, so that's the psychoactive component in marijuana, is getting a lot stronger. So the ratio of THC to the non-psychoactive component CBD is differentiating. And why this matters is because we see a link between higher potency and risk for first disorder symptoms. And a lot of people may not be aware that cannabis use disorder exists, but there it is in the diagnostic manual that you can meet criteria for this. And some of the symptoms might be loss of control, inability to stop using, cravings, etc. And recent data from the National Institute of Drug Abuse says that about 30% of those that use marijuana might have some of these symptoms that fall within disordered use. And why we care about this in teenagers is that the earlier use, so for example, before age 18, you are more likely to develop a marijuana use disorder than adults. And I want to share some statistics on other drug use. For example, any illicit use other than marijuana. Rates are a lot lower for these substances, but it still is concerning, especially for substances like narcotics and opioids. And there has been a recent surge in opioid deaths driven mostly by fentanyl. And fentanyl is basically it's a synthetic opioid, and it's much more potent than non-synthetic opioids. So a very small amount of this can be deadly. It's very highly potent. And because of this, we are seeing this huge uptick in pediatric opioid deaths in recent years, which is largely attributable to fentanyl use. So now that I gave an overview of different type of substances, I want to talk about why some individuals are more prone to substance use and why teenagers in general compared to other age groups are more likely to use substances. There are a few common reasons for use, one being to fit in. So social pressure, you might have heard of the old adage, peer pressure to use, to feel good. So getting that high, that sensation of feeling high to do better. So performance enhancement, thinking about using like Adderall, for example, to be able to stay up partying or stay up late, stay up to study and to feel better. So to deal with, for example, social anxiety, to cope with feelings that are related to anxiety or depression. And so we see that there are three key brain areas involved in substance use and that are relevant to adolescents in particular, which I'll talk a little bit about. First, the reward circuitry in the brain. So when you use a drug, it strongly stimulates the reward circuitry in your brain. This happens naturally to rewarding natural rewards, but drugs really like overwhelm the system. And so that is largely attributable to dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in feelings of pleasure. It's naturally occurring, but again, the substance use causes this massive influx of dopamine. And there's been some work done actually here at Michigan a few years ago showing that the dopamine is more associated with wanting rather than liking. So you might start using a substance because you like it, but then continued use just makes you reinforces that substance. And so this teaches the brain to seek drugs at the expense of other more like non-drug rewards and healthier goals. And now the emotion circuit. So this is related to that reason of use for coping, motivating addiction to ease withdrawal symptoms. And so why this is important in adolescents is we see that there is a lot of overlap in substance use and mental illness. And you can see that here with youth aged 12 to 17 that have had a past year depressive episode, and also we're using these different substances. And then the cognitive control circuit. So this is involved in higher order thinking, planning, problem solving. And this is the last part of the brain to reach maturity. And so this makes adolescents very vulnerable to substance use. And you can see that here pretty dramatically in this figure. So we call this like a developmental mismatch model or dual systems model. And you can see that the socio-emotional reward system matures much earlier than the cognitive control system that is involved in the more like prefrontal areas of the brain. And that development actually continues into the early 20s. And because of this, it makes adolescents more likely to act on impulse, misinterpret social cues, emotions, get into accidents, just overall engage in more risky behavior. And they're also less likely to think about consequences of their actions. And because of this, engage in more inappropriate or dangerous behaviors. So not only are certain aspects of the brain like associated with risk for substance use, but then once you start using substances, that can have an impact on the brain. And so adolescents are less likely to experience more of these immediate perceived harms related to substance use. So this leads to greater consumption, but also more damaging neurotoxic effects. So in some of the work we've done, we've looked at how earlier levels of substance use in adolescence had an impact on brain function later on in early adulthood. And we focus on two areas of brain function: inhibitory control, so that's related to the cognitive control processes, and then reward responding. And we did this by using functional magnetic resonance imaging. Some of you may have had an MRI or maybe even an fMRI. But basically, you go in a big magnet and it measures your blood flow in your brain. And so that can be linked to brain function, which you see in the kind of where the brain lights up, as some people say. So you can see which regions are activated while people are doing different tasks or even just being at rest in the scanner. And so for this study, we used an inhibitory control task and a reward task together. And we looked at people's activation in their brain while they were doing these tasks and then saw kind of where they fell in terms of level of activation. And this one group that I have highlighted here was particularly interesting because they had the highest rates of prior substance use and the highest level of reward activation. But we didn't expect for them to have the highest level of cognitive control as well, actually inhibitory control. So it's like the ability to withhold a response while they're doing a task, a button press task. But when we looked at their behavioral performance, they performed at the same level as the other classes. And so it made us think, I wonder if they're having to work harder to perform at the same level as the other individuals who don't have the heavier prior substance use. So this greater inhibitory activation might be compensatory. In this study, we looked at brain connectivity associated with risk and resilience for substance use. And this was in a high risk sample. So these individuals had a family history of substance use. So we classified them as either resilient. So they had this family history, but they were not substance users themselves, or they were high risk. So they had this risk factor and they were also engaging in substance use themselves. And so when they were in the scanner doing what's called a resting state scan, where they're at rest and we're just basically looking at connectivity in their brain, we found that resilient youth had stronger synchrony between brain regions involved in self-control. And so the implications of this are that boosting self-control and self-regulation could be a target of prevention and intervention efforts, especially in individuals that might be more vulnerable. And some really interesting work that's going on here at Michigan and also 20 sites across the country is from the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And so the goal of this study is to look at a huge sample of youth, so over 11,000 9 and 10-year-olds. They're tracking over 10 plus years. So they're trying to disentangle what are some early risk factors versus what is a cause of substance use and what are the effects of that. So kind of the cause and effect. And so this is ongoing right now, but hopefully it'll be able to disentangle some of these kind of like risk factors versus what's a consequence across a lot of different areas of functioning too, not just substance use. One study we did using this data set was looking at, well, what are the very, even though they're pretty young, like are any of these younger kids starting to use substances? And so we did look at early experimentation. What you're seeing here is actually full use. So they use a full drink or a puff of cannabis or a nicotine product. And we found that the good news is, more good news, bad news here. The good news is that by age 13, most teens are not using substances. So this goes against kind of this, a lot of teens think that a lot more people are using than they actually are. And so it's important, I think, for youth to see this, that, the vast majority are not using. But it still is concerning because, that's a sizable number that are using at this early age. And we know that those are most at risk for going on to having substance use problems later on. In this study, I used ABCD study data to look at early individual peer and parent level factors related to substance use before individuals are using. So these are like substance use related thoughts and perceptions. And these individuals, they were all naive users at this time. So one thing we looked at was curiosity to use substances. And we found that approximately 10% of 9 and 10-year-olds did report any curiosity to use alcohol or nicotine, and about 3% reported a curiosity to use cannabis. And youth with more perceived peer use were more likely to have curiosity to use. So this question got at how many of your friends do you think are using? And typically people overinflate that. And then we also looked at a few parent-reported questions. And so we found that youth of parents who reported easier availability of substances, those individuals had more curiosity to use. And then what I found was most interesting is that we asked about parent rules for substance use. And very few parents had made rules about not using substances. So it wasn't that they made rules that like you can't use. It was just they hadn't made any rules at all. But we know that youth are starting to think about substances and have an awareness of substances. Okay. So speaking of more resources for parents, since their parents have a big role in teens' lives, especially when they're living at their house and they're at a time where peers are becoming more important, but parents still have an important role to play in adolescents' lives. So this article came out recently in the New York Times, and I thought it was relevant to today's talk. So it's how to talk to teens about edibles. And as you can see in this figure on the right, there are a lot of different ways to use marijuana and cannabis. And the one most relevant to teens is the edible products infused with marijuana. A lot of them look like candies or gummy bears or brownies. Also the vaping, sometimes people can kind of hide it because you might think like they're using nicotine, but it's actually THC. But with the edibles, as they state here, concern is as like dosage. And so if you're eating a normal gummy bear, you might, pop the whole thing in your mouth. But with these edibles, the dosage might be a quarter of the gummy bear or half a gummy bear. And a lot of teens don't have that awareness. And then and I thought this comment was helpful too, of that parents should talk more about the basic biological realities, so how the substances have an impact on your brain and body, rather than focusing on like moral or legal considerations. And then that's what's really the teens listen to a lot more. Let's see here. Okay, got distracted by the chat for a second. Sorry. Okay, so now I want to share these resources for parents. So on the left, you can see information by NIDA, that's the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and on the right, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. And if you notice on the upper right of both of those figures, there's a little search bar. So if you want to go on these websites, if you put in, parent, teen, anything, like it'll help you search where you want to go. But I wanted to pull up these particular sites here. So this one, for example, on NIDA's website, talking about signs of that your child might have a problem with substances. I mean, this goes also for spouses. A lot of times we want to, or friends, like you want to ignore the signs, but it's important to be aware of them. So for example, spending time with different friends, having problems at school, not caring about your appearance, losing interest in things you used to be interested in. And then this is from NIAAA, the alcohol agency. So parents can talk early and often in developmentally appropriate ways about concerns with substance use. And this relates to what I showed you with the data, that a lot of parents have not made rules at all about substances because they haven't probably talked to their kids about substances by 9 and 10, but maybe we should start having those conversations earlier. And then another thing I have pointed out here is being aware of your state's laws about providing alcohol to your own children. So in Michigan, you can't sell, furnish, or give alcohol to anyone under 21 years of age. So it's not okay to give your child, so it doesn't matter, who the person is. It is illegal regardless. And then here's resources for teens. So I think these can be helpful too, especially, if you are uncomfortable how to talk to your kids, or like, maybe you just want to give them extra resources too. This is the NIAAA, so the alcohol agency. And they have this cool new thing out. It's a virtual reality look at alcohol in your brain. You can also use the non-VR version too, which is on their website, but it kind of goes through travels through your brain and looks at what areas are affected by heavy substance use. And then finally, this is from NIDA. They have these little videos here that are good short clips about how marijuana works and what are the effects of it. Some people think marijuana is harmless, but it goes through and talks about the short-term effects. Also, a lot of people think marijuana is calming, but it actually can cause anxiety and panic attacks in naive users. And so that's something that a lot of people aren't aware of, and more of the long-term effects too. And they talk about all the different categories of drugs. So it's a fantastic resource. It's all science-backed. So I definitely recommend looking at those for more information, because unfortunately I can't talk about everything in today's talk. So, and that is it for me. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you for the presentation, Megan. I'm Elliot. I'm a recovering drug addict. I'm really grateful to be here, and grateful to have the opportunity to share my story with you guys. So I started using drugs when I was 16. The first drug I ever used was Adderall. It was a prescription that I was buying for my friend. And, at the time, I'd really been struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. And I had really reached the end of my rope with those things, at least I felt. And using amphetamines was like my whole life I've been searching for this magic pill, and I finally found it. That's what it seemed like to me at the time, you know. I was a terribly insecure person. I hated myself, you know, to be completely honest. And I was, you know, there were times when I could barely get out of bed, you know. And drugs, like, it was the exact opposite of that. I thought I found my answer. I thought I'd arrived. Excuse me. And so I was staying up all night. I wasn't afraid of anybody. I thought I was, you know, king of the world. Um, I was uh, out getting into trouble, you know, uh, but it starts out as fun and games, you know. And it's kind of hard to tell where things are going to go. I think there were some signs even back then. I was digging pills out of the trash. My friends would have to come over and help me throw drugs out. I remember someone had to come and like help me throw them into a pond. People would be grabbing drugs out of my hands, like, because I couldn't put it down. And like, that's my friends, you know. I knew it from the first time I got high. I was hooked. And I believe that's because I suffer from the disease of addiction. And the symptom is just drug use, you know. But you know, things progressed, and it got to the point where even the people, my friends that I was getting high with, were, you know, they started thinking, hey man, this guy's crazy, he's going overboard. So they stopped selling me pills, and I just switched to different drugs. Marijuana was always very socially acceptable, so I would smoke that in social environments. I used a lot of kratom, uh, which is probably a somewhat little known drug. Um, I did LSD. Um, I put myself in dangerous situations, and I very nearly got one of my friends killed. We kind of enabled each other, and they ended up taking um, what what they believed and what I believed to be laced Xanax pills, and they um, could have easily overdosed on those. And around that time, I started to think that I could see the consequences of my actions. Like, what I was doing was harming other people, and I wanted it to stop. Because to be honest, I reached a point very quickly where I was no longer having fun using drugs. Like, the crashes kept getting worse. It got harder and harder to get them. You know, I was running out of money. People didn't want to be around me as much. And this is not even in a year of using drugs for me. Um, but I decided to get help. Um, and that's how I came into contact with the UMATS program. And it wouldn't really be until much later that I ever utilized anything that was offered to me there. But I'm glad I came into contact with that program at that time. So fast forward to, you know, around the time I turned 18, I was stealing to support my drug habit. I'd stopped caring about my friends. I only called people when I ran out of drugs and I needed somebody to drive me to the, you know, to the bong shop so I could buy some kratom, or so I could sneak, you know, to the pill cabinet at their house and steal something. And again, I still couldn't see it. You know what I mean? I still couldn't see that there was problematic behavior there. When I was 18, I found cocaine and I got into my first treatment center in a month. And that was really like the end of the good times. I got out, I was high again in 4 days. My friends, you know, I remember the look of disappointment on my friend's face. Um, I was getting high right in front of them, and all these people that had wanted me to get better. And it didn't, you know, I thought I had to. I couldn't see any other way to live my life. So um, it really fell off there. Those were the end of the good times, I would say. And the first treatment center, it didn't work because I wasn't ready. I was, you know, going to parties, having parties at my house. I was it was still easy to get drugs, relatively speaking. I had the money for it. Although I'll be totally honest, I probably blew about $2,000 in like 4 or 5 months on drugs, cigarettes, and buying things when I was intoxicated. Um, and I remember my dad, he came into my room like bawling his eyes out that he didn't want me to die, you know. And this is right before I went to the first rehab that I was in, and I cried with him, I hugged him, and then he got up and left, and I stared at my dope man's number on my phone, and I thought about getting rid of it, but I couldn't do it. I just, it didn't matter, you know what I mean? It didn't matter who I hurt. Um, like I had really reached that point, and it just kept on. I started feeling like I was gonna die. Getting high, I had pains in my arms and my chest when I was using, and all I could do is just wait. I say, oh, watch the clock. Let me wait 15 more minutes, 30 more minutes, and I think I can do more. Um, and The thought of having to go tell somebody that I was having, I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. I'm paranoid. I'm anxious. You know what I mean? I'm crashing off this thing and I still feel sick. The thought, and I thought in my head, if I go tell somebody, they're going to take my drugs away. You know what I mean? And so it became more important for me to get high than it did for me to protect my own safety. Throughout my using, I was in plenty of bad situations. I mean, I rolled the dice every time I got high. Quite frankly, I was in a car chase. I was threatened with physical violence, like all of these things that are just absurd situations for anybody to be in. And it just didn't phase me. I thought it was normal because I could just numb all the bad emotions out. But all the problems that I had been getting high to solve were getting worse and worse and worse. And the home environment was deteriorating severely. I feel really poorly about the way that I treated my family. My brother particularly got it rough because, I mean, he really wasn't responsible. And to him, this was this thing that was like coming in and destroying his life. I mean, he was my identical twin brother, and drugs made me a monster to him. I would goad at him all the time. I I really wanted to spite him, and it was because I was afraid that he didn't like me. You know what I mean? That's you know a story for another day as far as insecurity goes. But um, it got to the point where there's white powder all over the floor in my room, and people are, I'm afraid of everybody in my house because to me they're just gonna barge in and find my dope. And you know I mean, I was like, and when a bag would run out, I'd get down on my hands and knees and I would lick the dust off the ground, and it would taste like whatever kind of uh dirt or poop I tracked in on my shoes. um and I just didn't care. And I got sat down with my uh, psychotherapist and counselor through UMATS and my family, and it was like, okay, man, you got to stop. And if you don't stop, you can't live here anymore. And I swore up and down. I wasn't gonna, that I was gonna take it seriously, that I wasn't gonna get high, that I was gonna get better, blah blah blah. I didn't mean any of it, and sure enough, a week later, I'm sleeping on a friend's couch. And to my parents' credit, I think that was probably um, one of the best things they ever did. And later on down the line, because I came back with my tail between my knees, the shame that I felt, just like I was so done. I was probably withdrawing from all the drugs I'd been doing, like lying on the floor in my parents' house, like begging them to you know, let me back. And like my pride was so damaged. I just felt subhuman. And so I come back and then I recommit. Hey, I'm going to go to AA meetings. I'm going to do this. Right. And at the time, I'd just been getting into worse and worse drugs, opioids, just a lot of bad stuff. Anything I could get my hands on, I would get drugs from people at school, pills. I beg people to sell me their pills. I would wait for an hour in the snow for my dope man to come. And so this month goes by. I'm going to AA meetings, but I was abusing a prescription I had for Wellbutrin. because I am a drug addict, and if it makes me feel different, I'm going to take it. And so and that it was a miserable drug. And I remember every time was about to use it, I would say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And I would use it anyway. And so enough time goes by, and I was at the bottom of I was at the bottom. Um, I I had just bought a crack pipe on my friend's birthday, my best friend's birthday. The only reason I wanted to hang out with him so I could go buy a crack pipe from the smoke shop. And I'd started using cocaine again. Um, I was using kratom, hydroxyzine, a good combination of drugs. And I remember I just got done with it and I had to say something. And so and what it all culminated in is my mom having to rip a bag of coke out of my hand. And then I'm in the hospital the ER 2 times in a week for using too many drugs, thinking I'm going to die. And then so the second time I'm in the hospital, I'm sitting there in the hospital bed, and my shrink from UMATS from 2 years ago, I'm eternally grateful for her because she came to see me in that hospital. I was on a 48-hour hold. I couldn't leave. And it was like, okay, you go to rehab, you go to a long-term treatment facility, or you're homeless. I had nothing. You know what I mean? Nobody, my family thought I was a danger. My friends didn't want me to be around them. I was, sad to them. I had no money, no phone, nowhere to go. I used up all of my, my last chances. And that's what it took, because I've been, ever since I checked into rehab on June 7th, 2023, I have not had a drink or a drug. And I I did that with the community around me. The community, I found there are lots of different paths to recovery. For me, I use the 12 steps. I'm part of 12-step groups. And I found that community I have, going to rehab was great for me because I was away from the drugs. And in the rehab I was in, we got to go to meetings. And for me, that's where I found this recovery. And I can't explain it. I really can't explain it other than that I was like ready to be done, because it still kind of eludes me how I could ever lose the desire to use drugs. But today I have absolutely, I have no desire to use. And one thing that I was told early on in my recovery is that you never have to use again, no matter what. And I laughed about it then, but I never have to use, no matter what happens. I have a choice today. I have a choice about whether or not I'm going to pick up, a drink or a drug. I never had that choice before. All I could do was use, you know what I mean? I pretended that I could. But I came to understand my disease. I came to understand what I can do every day to not pick up. And recovery is a long road. And unfortunately, like, the person has to choose it. I was, no matter how badly my parents wanted me to get clean, it wasn't going to happen until I was ready. And they made a lot of good decisions in the end about not, enabling me. Right. I clearly was not, willing to meet them halfway with anything because I was sick, because in my head, I had to have drugs to survive. I lived to use and I used to live. My entire thinking was consumed by finding ways and means to use uh, drugs. And so for them, it was like, you can't be here anymore. And like that helped. It really did, because I got this gift of desperation. And, the gift of desperation is what got me into recovery. And the love that I found in the communities that I've been a part of, and like these opportunities for service, to be of service, to share my story with the next person. Like, there is so much hope, and I am so much. There's Steve-O. I don't know if you guys know who Steve-O is, but he was he's part of the Jackass crew, that MTV thing, and he had this quote, and it's like, drug addiction is like the only disease where when you recover it from it, you become a better person than you were before you started. You know what I mean? If I get a cold, I can only hope to be as good as not having a cold. But with recovery, like I found a way to be like really myself and really live, because I was a drug addict, because there was always, I suffered from the disease of more until I came into recovery and I found a way to stay clean. I found that I can sit with myself and that I can be okay with who I am and not need something outside of myself to change the way I feel or validate myself, because there was a real sickness that I had, but like I am alive today. And unfortunately, I know people who are not, you know, and it is a really, really scary disease out there. It's, I was playing with my life. And I'm really, really grateful that I found recovery. Um, and that, that I had that opportunity, because a lot of people don't get it. And I think really what I get to do today is live a full life and help people and have people help me. Like I can be of service. I can feel happy. I wake up in the morning and my skin doesn't crawl because I don't have dope. I wake up in the morning and I think about brushing my teeth and washing my face and going to work or doing whatever. I can get help for other problems. Like I still have a lot of mental problems. Just because I got clean doesn't mean everything went away. You know what I mean? But I have the ability to deal with those things as they come, handle life on life's terms, without freaking out and destroying my life. Um, and it's a really beautiful thing. Um, I don't know how to really wrap this up, but I just think like I have true serenity now. Um, Sometimes it's not perfect. It's a fight every day. Some days are worse than others, but I find the strength in myself and in other people not to pick up. Um, but I think I'll just circle back to saying today, I don't have to use no matter what. You know what I mean? Like, and that's real serenity for me, real presence, because before I always thought about where my next hit was coming from. How am I going to get, this next bag? What's going to happen when I come down? Now it's like I don't have to worry about that. I can be in the present and I can rest assured that no matter what happens in my life, I'm never going to have to be where I was. I'm never going to have to pick up um, a drink or a drug again. And I think that's where I'm going to end my portion of this.
Thanks so much, Elliot. That was really powerful and so helpful to hear. And Dr. Martz's presentation really helped frame how we think about why we worry about the developing brain. What are those particular vulnerabilities that we all need to keep in mind, and how it impacts, when we act, how we think about prevention, but also how we think about the kids in our lives as adults. Um, so I do want to acknowledge questions that have been coming in, and I know that some of them have been answered. Um, there was one question about how to tell if your child is using versus a normal bipolar episode. Um, I can just give a brief answer about, the challenges that exist with teasing that apart. If someone is using actively, that it can be so hard to know what is a baseline mood cycle separate from all of the things that impact your mood. Anxiety, irritability. Elliot really highlighted some of those kind of ups and downs really, really well. So there's no one singular test, but if we know that somebody is using, it does help frame the way that we monitor mood patterns over time. And it does often take having a period of sobriety for us to be able to really understand that. And that period, it really often has to be several months because of the impact of the use over time. So I hope that helps answer that question. And Elliot, yeah, do you
Yeah,
want to say
if I
something?
could briefly speak on that, I actually was recently in my recovery um, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and like it is a difficult question because how do you tell? And it does depend on the person. Like I've had some struggles being honest with other people in recovery about my issues with bipolar disorder, because sometimes my behavior does mirror stimulant use. But um, I think as I think it really does come down to, once I'm on medication for my bipolar disorder, it's a lot, like it's not out of control. And when there are still patterns coming up, and I think persistent lying and like more deceptive manipulative behaviors can be more what I would characterize under more likely to be substance use. But I'm also not a doctor, and I can only speak from my own experience, which is relatively limited as far as like other people's experience of bipolar and substance use.
No, that's a great thing to point out, Elliot. Thanks. Um, I just wanted to pivot to some of the other questions that came in. And I think, some of these were addressed in the presentation around, for example, the relationship between mental health concerns and substance use when you're a teen, some of the strategies for communication. Um, I have one question here that I get a lot, and I'm curious to hear what you think, Dr. Martz. What role do peers or friends play in substance use, and how can parents address this? And Elliot, you might want to chime in on that one too.
Yeah, there's a lot of research showing that there is a big impact of peers on substance use. But I think they're not all bad. I think there can be positive influences and positive people. And I think but having that awareness can be difficult on like who to, be around. And there's, you start to like associate some people with that substance. And so like you see them and it might make you want to use more too, is something to think about. Like that person is kind of a cue for you. Um, but yeah, and I think like I mentioned before, how people think a lot more of their peers are using than they are. And so looking at the data saying like, okay, well, 20% of kids are using by this age, but that means that 80% aren't. So flipping those percentages too, I think can be helpful in terms of like what's going on with peers. Nelly, I don't know if you have anything to add. If not, that's fine.
Yeah, I briefly say, like, I feel like with with there's a lot of social influences, environmental factors that put me in contact with drugs. But I think it, in the way that the type of recovery I've come to understand, like my addiction goes much deeper than just drug use, and that the first time I used, I was hooked. So a lot of it's the environment can be there, but the problem might not develop just because of the environment. And a lot of times I was the only one in my environment. I always used hard drugs on my own. And so once that addiction develops, it's more about what lengths I was willing to go to find drugs. But and again, like with teenagers, like anything anybody told me, I was like, I'm not going to listen to you. Like I'm going to hang out with who I want to hang out with. But that was just the relationship that I had with my family at the time.
Thanks, Elliot. Um, just trying to keep track. Um, I think related to that, Elliot, if you're comfortable with this question, is there anything, I think this is a question I hear a lot too, like, is there anything your parents could have done earlier in a different way that you think would have changed this course for you? And that's so hard to know, but
Yeah, I think that's a really good question that doesn't have a good answer. It is, like, for me, like I said, I had to get to that point where I was willing to stop. I mean, I have my childhood was fantastic, right? Like there weren't issues. I've had a very loving family. It wasn't necessarily any thing they could have said before to influence it. And I think uh, the nature of my sickness was the more they tried to help me, the more compassion they tried to show to me. When I was using, the more I tried to use it against them and manipulate that situation. And really, I knew I was addicted from the first pill, and I knew there was no stopping me until I I burned out, and I got to that point where, you know, I'm like paranoid all the time. I'm, about to be homeless, in the hospital multiple times. Like, that's really where it started to cross the line for me. And it's hard to say, because there are people out there, you know what I mean, that are shooting up and overdosing every day on the street, and they get Narcan, they come back up and they think this is not far enough. You know what I mean? So it's very difficult to tell where someone is going to find that bottom. And just because I found it once doesn't mean I'm not capable of finding it again if I go, try to find out. So I have to be very careful. I have to remember where I've been and where I'll go, um, if I pick up again. But there is no easy answer to that. It's the, my parents had to basically say, "You're out, we're cutting you out." And I'm glad they helped me go to, paid for my rehabilitation. But that was like the extent that our relationship could be at that point. And if I wasn't willing to accept that help, there was nothing they could have done, because I every time they had tried to reach out to me, in when I had the desire to use, I had manipulated them. And so it is unfortunate. I feel there's no sure thing that you can do to stop somebody, because no matter how bad you want them to stop, they're not going to do it until they want to.
That's really helpful. And to reiterate some of the things that have been said, we know that, you know, parents who are clear about how they feel and what they believe about substance use, and who, are clear about the fact that it's not okay in our house, et cetera. We know that things like that are protective. So, it may not put the brakes on something, but when we think about like the environment that kids are in, we know that those clear messages from adults can be really, really helpful. Um, just monitoring our time. I did want to check our questions again. We addressed this a little bit, but Dr. Martz, do you want to say anything else about family history and susceptibility and what we understand about that in terms of risk?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done here at Michigan through the Michigan Longitudinal Study. Dr. Bob Zucker and Mary Heitz have done a lot of work on that. And the study, it started back, in the 80s, and back then they're like, well, why would you need to look at the kids of those people, like, and follow them? Like, why do they matter? Isn't it the adult that you need to worry about? And so it was really the first study showing that children living in homes with a parental substance use can have an impact, but not all of them going to have problems themselves. So the most high risk pathway to later substance use is we call like an externalizing pathway. So kids that are more likely to act out and like be more aggressive and just kind of high sensation and risk seekers are typically those that grow up in families like that do have more problems later on. But what I was really intrigued about when I started looking at this data is just how many kids didn't go on to have problems themselves, which has led to some resilience work I did and understanding that. And but I think it's important to know you have that vulnerability and that like the genetic, risk. And so being aware of like what situations you put yourself in. Um, but and sometimes it can even skip a generation too. So just, being aware of kind of like where you're at as in terms of like your risk. And there's a lot of different risks factors. Not all of them end up, having negative outcomes, but just I think it's important for people to kind of be aware of where they're at and what things can maybe lead to more problems. But it's pretty common. I think in the ABC study, about 17% of kids in that have a family history of substance use in that sample. So it's pretty common. It can, affect anybody. I mean, I don't think addiction, it doesn't care if you're rich or poor or what color you are. So it can have an impact on a whole wide array of individuals.
Yeah. Thank you. And, I think it reminds me of what Nora Valka says, who's the director of NIDA, about, substance use disorders being a disease of adolescence. So in other words, the priming that goes on maybe from our environment or our genetic vulnerabilities. If you start that use at a younger age, the greater your risk is for having use disorder as an adult. So that's why we care so much about treatment and prevention when it's possible for our kids. I do want to be mindful of the time and just share a little bit with all of you about the treatment services available at UMATS. So as we mentioned before, and I'm hoping we can get this to, there we go. The University of Michigan Addiction Treatment Services is a part of our clinical space within the Addiction Center. So we offer evaluations, consultations, and management for those patients who are dealing with a primary substance use disorder, and we take care of both adolescents and adults. And it's very multidisciplinary. So there are psychiatrists, there are physicians boarded in addiction medicine, advanced practice providers, social workers, psychologists, and then our trainees as well. So we use a lot of different types of interventions, including psychotherapy, medications, group interventions, individual therapy. And, not all the patients who see us will necessarily need a medication. So we are very glad to see anybody who's interested in trying to understand or change their use. And I mentioned our age range previously, and we're able to see most major private insurances and Medicare patients. So in terms of what the type of care, we have a number of groups, both for our adult patients and our adolescent patients. Often our care involves a combination of seeing a therapist for individual care and being involved in an appropriate type of group intervention for a series of weeks or maybe months. And then when needed, working with one of our providers who's also able to prescribe medications. And then this includes some of the resources, and I know a lot of those have been going into the actual chat function as we've been presenting today. So I'm going to stop there and end here by just thanking everybody for joining us, and really hope that this has been helpful information for all of you. In particular, I want to thank our presenters here today who really made this a wonderful event. So thank you to Dr. Martz, and thank you to Elliot. And also just acknowledge that the educational series has been made possible through really generous donations to the University of Michigan Addiction Center, which we're very appreciative of. Please note the links that were in the chat, including our resource page and the clinic. And thank you again for coming this evening. Take care.